Greg, Kading, thank you so much for being on the show and being with us at Hot 97 all the way from the West Coast. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Just for people who are watching, what was your role during these times, Biggie's murder and for Tupac's murder?
Well, my role was as a homicide investigator. I was working for the LAPD. There was a lawsuit being waged against the city by Valletta Wallace and her estate, alleging that there was corruption related to the murder, that either cops were involved directly in the murder or they were covering it up. And so as a result of this lawsuit, they put together a task force of individuals. I was one of those individuals, and we were re-investigating Biggie's murder. And just kind of by default, we started to investigate Tupac's murder because of the evidence that we were developing in the investigation.
So for a lot of us, when we first heard this, we were so confused initially, like how, why is there all this evidence? The evidence was kind of clear, not clear, which is why we're so thankful that you actually have this movie to explain in depth what was going on. So why did you decide to keep investigating the murders of Tupac and Biggie?
Well, when I was on the police department, it was my job, it was my responsibility. And that's when we developed all the critical evidence and came to the conclusions that we came to in both of the two murder investigations. But afterwards, when I left the department, I retired in 2010 and decided to publish a book so that we could inform the public as to what we discovered in the investigation.
In the movie, because people don't know what to expect, there's been so many different documentaries about Tupac and Biggie. So, what is it about this film that's going to be so different that obviously is worth everybody's time?
This film is different because we're not proposing a theory. Everything that preceded this was theoretical. It's speculation. It's what could have happened. And we're not coming at it from that approach. We're telling you definitively this is what took place in these murders. All of the empirical evidence, all of the facts lead you to draw this one and only conclusion. And so we're not competing against theories. We're claiming to know the truth.
Can you kind of explain as much as you can who in this or is, I guess, behind the Tupac murder or the Biggie murder, and what details will they be able to see in the movie?
Well, what we tried to do was explain how there was an evolution of conflict between the CEOs of the two major record labels, with Sean Combs out on the East Coast and Bad Boy and Suge Knight out here with Death Row. There was conflict at the CEO level. There was conflict at the artist level between, Biggie and Tupac. And then the gangs that the labels were associating with were natural enemies, Crips and Bloods. But once things got personal within these record labels, then the Crips and Bloods were obviously at war together too. And that's what culminated, those three levels of conflict culminated in the murders of Tupac and Biggie.
What happens that you have all this evidence and it seems like there's still no closure? We still have no real arrests. We can't officially say, yes, this person did it. He XYZ, he, she, or whatever. Why can't we do that, especially when you do have evidence? This isn't based off opinions.
Right. Well, you've got to keep in mind at the chain of events. In 2009, when we get the confessions of the co-conspirators in these murders, at that point in time, the shooters in both murders are already dead. Wardell Faust from the mob Piru, who shot Biggie, and Orlando Anderson from the Southside Crips, who shot and killed Tupac. Those guys are already dead. Now we're just focusing on the co-conspirators. And then over a period of time, those guys start dying. As you know, Eric Martin out in New York, Zip, Puffy's associate, he died. And then just recently, the driver of the white Cadillac, Terrence Brown, also was shot and killed in Compton on an unrelated thing. So we've lost so much of the foundation of a prosecution. And you just can't practically go into court and face an icon like Puffy Combs and say, hey, we're going to base this allegation on the testimony of a convicted drug dealing gang member. It's just not a practical. It's not a practical matter for prosecution, and there will never be judicial closure in these cases, ever. It's a lost cause. So you're going to have to accept the facts that we're presenting and then make your own determination whether that's conclusive enough for you to close the book.
What do you think is the difference between all the information you gathered and the theories beforehand? Because there was this big theory with Anthony Mack and Amir Muhammad beforehand. Why couldn't prior investigations get the same kind of information that you guys did?
That's a great question, and you have to understand the nature of a conspiracy theory. A conspiracy theory starts with a conclusion and then works backwards to find evidence to support the conclusion. In an investigation, in an objective investigation, you start with no conclusions and you just follow the facts and the evidence as you discover them. And so that's the big difference. A conspiracy theory works backwards from a foredrawn conclusion. We went into it saying anything could be true. What do the facts and the evidence tell us? And that's the difference. So you've got our approach from inside out versus the conspiracy approach from outside with very limited access in.
In murder rap, so that people have an understanding, the conspiracies and everything that you talk about with the evidence that you have, what caused Tupac's murder?
An evolution of conflict. With Suge Knight, he always held Puffy responsible for what happened to his friend in Atlanta back in, was it 95, when Jake Robles was killed outside of a nightclub, and he held Puffy responsible for that. And so there was this tit for tat back and forth. There was armed conflicts with the gangs, backstage at different award shows, and there was just constant. Blood had already been spilled. There's public dissing going on, and then Tupac makes the fatal mistake of involving himself with the drama going on with the gangs. And when he jumps into that fight with Orlando Anderson at the MGM in Las Vegas, that was his fatal mistake. Leading up to that, in December of '99, one of Puffy Combs' associates was abducted out in Los Angeles and taken and beaten severely, with Tupac being involved, and Suge Knight and other members of the mob Piru, and they beat this guy silly and almost lost his eye, actually. And all of that was done in an attempt because Suge Knight was trying to find out where Puffy Combs' family residence was in Los Angeles. Puffy obviously found out about it, and he was in a very desperate situation. He knew if he came to the West Coast, Suge had a target, or he had a target on his back, and Suge was going to hunt him down. And it was out of that desperation and fear that he began to associate and solicit the help of these Crip gang members.
When this all came out, when obviously everyone's been talking about the movie Murder Rap, which is coming to Netflix soon, it's on iTunes, make sure you guys check it out. And Puffy came out and said that basically this is fiction.
He needs another PR guy, I'll tell you. He just needs somebody who will come out with something more original, because that's the standard line. This is pure fiction and completely ridiculous. Which is what he says to every allegation that's ever posed against him. Right. And, I understand why he can't come out and essentially take responsibility. I get that. Right. But he knows that this is not pure fiction.
And there's no motive for you other than you finding the truth, because it's not like you're emotionally, personally invested in Tupac's life or in Biggie's life. So this is just truly you going over the facts, the evidence, and trying to give the fans some type of closure that we've been all wanting for so long.
That's true. I self-published my book. This wasn't financially motivated. It's just, like I've said before, with knowledge comes responsibility. And when you know things and the public has a right to know those things, it's irresponsible not to share the information. And so that was the motive of the book. And then, of course, understanding the audience of, the urban audience and the rap audience, it's better done in a documentary form.
Absolutely.
Not a lot of guys are downloading and reading books.
Mm-hmm. So by the end of the movie, You interviewed Teresa Swan, and then it's almost like the rug got pulled under you. Do you think they care about solving or the Biggie murder at all? Like, are we ever going to get any kind of more? Are we ever going to get the full story out on Biggie's murder, like we did with Pac's?
Well, you're going to get the full story as we're telling you who the co-conspirators are. We're telling you that it was retaliation. Biggie was killed as a retaliation for Tupac's murder in Vegas and the shooting of Suge Knight. And so that's a really rather simple explanation when you just look at the facts. But as far as the LAPD ever coming out and saying, hey, we want to take responsibility for our failures, it's never going to happen. The police department does as good a job serving its own self-interests as it does serving the public's interests at times. And there's just no motive for them to come out and kind of fall on the sword and take responsibility for their shortcomings.
In your opinion, Greg, is there any way that, we can make them take responsibility, or do you just think it's a lost cause at this point?
It's a lost cause. For a long time, I've suggested that they publicly just say that they've cleared the case. If it was not a sensational celebrity murder, if this was just your average person that was killed, this would have been cleared hands down, and it would have been a solved case. But because it dealt with the lawsuit and the celebrity nature of these guys and all of these scandalous media attention, they're just not willing to do that.
I just wanted to touch base a little bit. When you were doing the investigation and you were interviewing Teresa, why did it end at that point? What was I felt like you were so close to sealing the deal, finding, answers. Why did that stop at that point? What happened with the letter? After that point, where do we go?
Well, once at that period of time, when we developed the evidence that conclusively be able to determine who killed Biggie, obviously the police department shared that evidence with Valletta Wallace's attorneys, and they realized that any further pursuit of this lawsuit is really kind of a waste of time and money because we can disprove the claims. And so once the lawsuit was then retracted by the Wallace estate, the LAPD lost its initiative. It lost its motivation. It spent a lot of time and money and energy, faced a lot of allegations, and I think they were just basically tired of it.
So the motive, my understanding, for the LAPD was to show that they weren't involved in it, and that's why really you got on the case, so that this could get finalized, that there was no corruption within them, because I guess I'm a little bit confused right there.
I understand your question. It's a great question. I think it can be very easily misunderstood. The LAPD never told us, go out and disprove our involvement. They said, go out and solve the crime, whatever it may be. If it turns out that it's David Mack and Amir Mohammed, then so be it. We'll fall on that sword. We have to, and that's why I said, fine, if that's what we're going to do, then we're bringing in the feds. We want to have that oversight. So I believe the LAPD believed that they weren't involved. There was no evidence to support the allegations that were made. However, they let us have free rein to go out and find out for ourselves as investigators. But once having accomplished that, once we came back and said, okay, we know what happened, and it wasn't us, they said, good, we're done.
Why not publicize that? I don't understand. Why not? If it wasn't for you, I believe so many of us fans would still think that they are the reason and were involved in Biggie's murder.
Yeah, and you've also got to take into consideration that the community already, at large has a mistrust of law enforcement, mistrust of cops, especially today. It's worse today than it was back in the late 90s or when I got on the case. It's worse now than ever. But because they already have this kind of preconceived idea of how corrupt cops are, it's very difficult for them to then, accept on the face value of what we're claiming. So I think that that's that's an obstacle that we're constantly fighting about. We're like, hey, don't rely on your preconceived notions about law enforcement. Listen to the facts that we're presenting and make a logical determination based on that. And, which it's hard to do.
Right,
Because
absolutely.
we do have corruption. We do have bad cops. And, we don't pretend that that's not true. There's a lot of problems in law enforcement, but they're overwhelmingly also a lot of good. And so that's, the dilemma.
Have you, or I guess during the investigation, have you guys tried to reach out to Puffy or, try to have a real conversation like, hey, one, we're just going over the facts, and two, we understand maybe your obvious concern, but has there been any attempt with that?
Of course, during the investigation, there was attempts. We had investigators from Los Angeles go to New York and try to interview him in regard to Christopher's homicide. And, he wouldn't speak with the homicide investigators. He has his lawyers who insulate him. And, it's probably in his best interest not to talk to us. So there have been attempts, but we can't force somebody to sit down and do an interview.
Totally understandable. So in Murder Rap, another, there's just so many different reasons why someone should watch it, but in it, there's a clear explanation of Puffy's role in this, because I think sometimes, when we see headlines, we don't really know, kind of know, he's saying it's fiction. So can you just briefly tell us exactly what people will see in the movie and get a better understanding of?
Yes, I think that it will put the situation into its proper context. To understand this, you have to go back to 1995, 96, and 97 and understand the environment of what was taking place between these crews and between these individuals. And you have to put it and understand it in that context. You have to understand Puffy's very precarious situation he was in. And, he either did something to protect himself, or potentially he was going to end up, at the wrong end of a bullet. Right. And so I want people to understand that context, because it's important. The headlines just say, hey, documentary claims that Tupac, that Diddy killed Tupac. It's not fair to the truth of the story.
After all these findings and everything, have you ever gotten in touch or gotten a chance to talk to any of Tupac's or Biggie's family members at all?
I did. Before I actually published the book, I went out to Pennsylvania. I went to Valletta's house and sat down and explained to her what we had discovered in the investigation. I gave her a copy of the book. We shed a few tears together. It was a very intense encounter. So yes, I did. I met with Valletta and explained to her what we had found out. And then I also made an attempt to reach Afeni Shakur, but instead I was diverted to her sister Gloria. I explained the same thing to Gloria. The response I got from the Shakur family was that, thank you very much, we appreciate everything you've done, but basically we already know what you're saying. We already know what you're claiming. And then I got to know Tupac's cousin William Lassane on a personal level and spent some time with him here at my house. So I feel like I've made an attachment to the families, and that they recognize that this effort was a genuine effort just to bring closure to them.
So Greg, when did you actually get involved? When were you hired to investigate Biggie's murder?
In 2006.
What was the delay?
The delay was the case had gone cold. In both Biggie and Tupac's murder investigations, they were very difficult to investigate from a law enforcement perspective, from a law enforcement standpoint, because nobody really wanted to cooperate. The nature of the people that were involved and knew, they just weren't going to come and sit down with the police and start ratting out their friends. So from a law enforcement perspective, they're very difficult cases to solve. And because of that, because we weren't getting the kind of cooperation we needed, the cases grew cold. And then they were cold cases, no proactive investigation going on. And it wasn't until the impetus of the lawsuit against the city where the LAPD said, holy shit, can I cuss?
Yes, absolutely.
Where the LAPD, started to recognize we need to solve this, because if we need to get to the bottom of this. And they allowed us to follow any lead that we discovered, and that's the reason I approached the department and said, we need to federalize this. Let's bring in all the federal agencies. Let's get a task force with federal oversight. And that way, at the end of the day, when people say, hey, it's just the LAPD still covering up for themselves, it's a moot point, because we've now brought in the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, and it was a collective effort where we all came to the same conclusion.
How long did it take you to find all of this evidence once you got on board?
It was years. I mean, we really, again, we had to come up with creative ways to try to get people to cooperate and to talk to us. Years had gone by, and now it was a matter of trying to come up with a new way to approach this, a new investigative strategy to try to get the cooperation from the people we knew would have some information to help us move forward.
Do you feel that when these murders initially happened, that the LAPD, the Las Vegas Police Department did a thorough job trying to get this resolved in a timely manner? Because it seemed like you did a way better job than they did. And I'm just curious, like, why didn't they find this exact same evidence and or more, because it happened then?
I think they did thorough jobs. I just don't think that they were creative. They weren't thinking outside of the box. They were just kind of going through the investigative 101 approach. Talk to people and evaluate your physical evidence. And at the end of the day, if you don't have anything to move forward with, you just sit back and wait for someone to call. They could have been much more proactive. In the Tupac case, you had this obstacle where Las Vegas is, in another state. All the culprits involved with death row records and the Southside Crips, they're all in Compton or in Los Angeles. And so because of this kind of distance, it made it more difficult for Las Vegas to really make any headway. And there were issues with Compton PD back at the time because there were off-duty officers working, moonlighting for death row records. And so Las Vegas PD was like, well, hold on, who do we trust? If we, how do we maintain the integrity of our investigation, but yet rely on people who might be compromised within law enforcement? So it made it very difficult for them. In Los Angeles, I think that we could have done a much better job with the Biggie investigation. They needed to take gang experts and utilize gang experts to make headway. And they used guys that weren't necessarily that intuitive about how gangs work and how to break the ice with the gangs.
Now, have you ever been worried about your life during any of this, Greg?
No, I don't think you go into the law enforcement field worried about, what's going to happen when you investigate crimes. If you are, if you're in fear of that, then you shouldn't become a cop. This is the nature of that, of that profession. I think that you run into trouble and you have a reason to fear when you start lying on people and you are misrepresenting or making false allegations. Those people that are out there promoting these conspiracy theories and falsely accusing people like Harry Billups and Amir Mohammed, falsely accusing people like Reggie Wright and Sharitha Knight, when you're falsely accusing those people, that's when I think you're putting your life in harm's way. But when you tell the truth, I think the truth is the best defense, both in court and in public.
And I think it's important. I just want everyone to know when this does, show up on Netflix, it's definitely worth watching. This isn't based off opinions. There's evidence. You could see the work, and maybe we'll never get the final closure that we all as fans want, but I think this is the closest we'll ever get, and I think it helps heal so many of our hearts. So Greg, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm so appreciative for the work you've done, and it doesn't matter if you're not a big or Pac fan or whatever, this is part of history and it's amazing, and it gives some type of closure I believe for everyone. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. If I could just add in there, if anybody wants to kind of pay attention to the process or the progress on Facebook, the producer of the film, Michael Dorsey, It has a great Facebook page. It's interactive. It's called Murder Rap Inside the Biggie and Tupac Investigations. It's updated every day. And what's really interesting is now that the door's been opened, people are starting to come forward, getting emails and calls like, hey, I was there, I knew about this. And so the story's not done being told, although we can say conclusively what happened. Right. It's just going to continue to get more and more support from those who knew what was up.
Greg, if you get more information and you continue to just investigate any other stuff, please release it for us to see, because it helps us all and it's part of our history and culture, and we really, really appreciate it, Greg.
I appreciate it too. I love New York, so I'm looking forward to coming out there and seeing you guys.